The ship was not supposed to be there. That was the first thing the Valori sensor officer said when the readings came in. A small vessel, human-built, sitting right in the middle of a protected corridor, a stretch of deep space that had been sealed off by Valori law for over 200 years. No beacon, no distress signal, no request for passage. It was just there, humming quietly, like it belonged. The Valori dispatched a boarding team without delay. They expected panic. They expected a crew pressed against the walls, eyes wide, hands shaking, begging not to be harmed. That was how first contact usually went with younger species. Fear first, then questions later. It was a pattern the Valori had seen dozens of times across hundreds of years, and they had no reason to believe this would be any different. The airlock opened. Wujin was sitting at a workbench near the back of the ship with a bowl of instant noodles in one hand and a micro-welder in the other. He looked up when the Valori stepped in, tall, silver-skinned, dressed in long ceremonial coats that shimmered under the ship's overhead lights. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked back at the component he was fixing. "Give me 1 second," he said. He finished the weld, set the tool down, ate one more bite of noodles. Then he turned around on his stool and gave the boarding team his full attention. "You're Valori," he said. Not a question. More like a man confirming something he had read about once in a manual. The team leader stepped forward and began the formal declaration. Protected corridor violation, mandatory detainment, the full legal weight of the Galactic Compact pressing down on this tiny vessel and its strange, unbothered occupant. Wujin listened with his hands folded in his lap. When the team leader finished, Wujin nodded and said, "All right. Can I bring my noodles?" That was humanity's first contact with the wider galaxy. It did not go the way the Valori planned. Back on Earth, the news arrived in layers. First the diplomatic channels, then the encrypted military feeds, then the official communique stamped with the seal of the Galactic Compact. Humanity had been found, humanity had been evaluated, and humanity, the Compact had decided, after what they described as careful and thorough review, was not ready. The formal offer came 3 weeks later. Earth was invited to join the Galactic Compact, not as a member, but as a ward species. The document explaining this was 47 pages long and written in careful, polite language that still managed to feel like a pat on the head. Ward species were civilizations that the Compact deemed too young, too unpredictable, or too dangerous to themselves to operate freely in interstellar space. They would receive protection. They would receive guidance. They would receive supervision. What they would not receive was a vote, or a voice, or the right to leave their own solar system without a Valori escort. Commander Yuna read the full document in her chair aboard the UEF flagship Hangang. She read it once quickly, then again slowly. The bridge was quiet. Her crew knew better than to speak when she had that look on her face. The calm, steady look that meant she was thinking about several things at once, and none of them were comfortable. When she finished, she set the document down on the table and looked at the Valori liaison standing at the far end of the room. He was young for a Valori, which still meant he was older than most human governments. He had the patient, faintly tired expression of someone who had done this many times before. "I have one question," Yuna said. "Of course, Commander." "Who are you protecting us from?" The liaison smiled. It was a gentle smile. The kind a teacher gives a student who has asked something obvious. "From yourselves," he said. "Humans are volatile. Your history shows patterns of conflict that are frankly alarming by galactic standards. And, beyond your own behavior, there are things in this galaxy that you are simply not equipped to face. We are doing you a kindness." Yuna looked at him for a long moment. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She said, "Understood," and thanked him for his time, and watched him leave the bridge. Then she turned to Deho, her second-in-command, who had been standing behind her the whole time. "Pull the patrol schedules for the Valori protection fleet," she said quietly. "All of them. Timing, routes, rotation windows, everything." Deho didn't ask why. He just nodded and got to work. The Valori protection fleet arrived at the edge of the solar system 5 days later. 12 ships, long and silver, hanging in the dark like ornaments. They were beautiful in a cold way, the way old monuments are beautiful, impressive, but still. They broadcast a greeting to Earth on a public frequency. They announced that humanity was now safe. They said it with great sincerity. On the Hangang, Rena pulled up the patrol data Deho had collected and started marking gaps on the star map. She found the first one in 20 minutes, then another, then 3 more. The Valori routes were wide and slow, built for visibility, not speed. They were designed to look powerful, not to respond quickly. There was a reason for that, she noted. A fleet that had not fought a real engagement in centuries tends to optimize for appearance. She flagged every gap, every blind window, every stretch of space between patrol passes where a ship, say, a human ship, could move freely without being seen. Tyke leaned over her shoulder and looked at the map. He was eating something from a foil packet, as he almost always was. He studied the gaps for a moment. That's a lot of holes, he said. Yes, Rena agreed. For a protection fleet. Yes? He thought about it, chewing slowly, almost like they're not really here to protect us. Rena saved the file and sent it to Yuna without another word. That night, Yuna stood alone at the forward observation window of the Hangang and looked out at the stars. The Valori ships were visible at the far edge of the display, distant, glittering, confident. She thought about the liaison smile. From yourselves, he had said, and from what is out there. She pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass and traced the shape of the patrol gaps from memory. Something was out there. She was sure of it. And whatever it was, the Valori were not going to be the ones who handled it. She turned away from the window and went back to work. The distress signal came in at 0340 hours ship time. Most of the Hangang's crew was asleep. The Night Watch officer caught it first. A broken, repeating frequency, not human in origin, broadcasting from a stretch of neutral space about 4 light hours beyond the edge of Valori jurisdiction. He ran the translation through 3 different filters before he was sure of what it said. Then he called Deho. Deho listened to it once and called Yuna. She was already awake. She had been awake for an hour. Sitting at her desk with a cup of cold tea and Rena's patrol gap analysis open on the screen in front of her. When her comm buzzed, she picked it up before the second pulse. "Show me," she said. The signal resolved into coordinates and context within minutes. A Kale merchant convoy, 3 small ships, slow-moving, lightly built, had been intercepted by Drex raiders in neutral space. The Kale were not fighters. Everyone in the galaxy knew that. They were traders, quiet and careful, who survived by being useful and unnoticed. They had no weapons worth mentioning and no allies close enough to matter. The Valori protection fleet received the same signal 11 seconds after the Hangang did. Yuna pulled up the Valori response channel and listened. There was discussion. There was procedural language. Someone mentioned that neutral space fell outside the formal protection mandate. Someone else noted that engaging the Drex without authorization from the High Consul could create a diplomatic incident. A third voice said that the appropriate forms would need to be filed before any action could be sanctioned, and that given the time difference between here and the Compact's central office, a response could be expected within. Yuna closed the channel. She looked at Deho. How long does a Kyle convoy last against 4 Drex raiders? Deho checked the combat data. 20 minutes. Maybe less. How fast can we get there? 15 minutes, if we push the drive. She was already standing. Get Tyke. Tell Wu Jin to prep the frigate. We're going light. Just the escort, not the Hangang. Less noise. Deho opened his mouth, closed it, and went to make the calls. They jumped 9 minutes later. The frigate came out of the jump corridor at speed, cutting into the engagement zone with the kind of entry that made Rena grip her console with both hands and say something under her breath that was not a prayer, but was close to one. Yuna was at the command station. Tyke was at weapons. Wu Jin was in the engine bay, doing something to the power distribution that he had not fully explained to anyone, and that the ship's computer kept flagging as inadvisable. The scene in front of them was exactly what the signal had described. 3 Kyle ships, small and battered, being herded by 4 Drex raiders. Wide, dark vessels with aggressive angles and hull markings that looked like old scars. The Drex were not destroying the Kyle ships. They were toying with them, cutting off routes, forcing them to slow down. That was how the Drex worked. Patience as a weapon. They haven't seen us yet, Tyke said. They will in about 4 seconds, Yuna said. So let's not waste the 4 seconds. She gave the order. What followed lasted 11 minutes. It did not feel like 11 minutes to the people inside it. It felt much shorter for Yuna and much longer for the Drex. She came in at the angle Rena had identified during the approach, the gap between the two lead raiders where their sensor overlap was weakest, and hit the first ship with a targeted systems pulse that knocked out propulsion without breaching the hull. The second ship tried to turn, and Tyke was already ahead of that, and firing a tight spread that collapsed the raider's forward shielding and forced it to pull back or lose the whole front section. The third raider made a run at the Kale convoy. Yuna cut it off personally, bringing the frigate between the raider and the Kale ships with very little room to spare. Daiho, who was watching the proximity readings, quietly looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked back at his screen. The fourth raider, the largest one, held position for exactly 40 seconds. Then it turned and ran. Yuna let it go. That was the part people would ask about later. She had the angle. Wu Jin had the power back up. Tyke was already tracking it. She could have disabled it like the others. Instead, she gave the order to hold fire and watched it go. "You let it leave," Daiho said. Not an accusation. He just wanted to understand. "I want them to report back," she said. 4 ships went out. 1 came home. Let them think about that. The 3 disabled Drex raiders were left drifting, crews intact, life support running, a navigation beacon attached to each one broadcasting their location so they could be retrieved, clean, deliberate. A message written in the way the ships were left, not destroyed. The Kyle convoy was untouched. Yuna brought the frigate alongside the lead Kyle ship and opened a channel. The response that came back was quiet and a little stunned. A thin voice, ear high and careful, expressing gratitude in formal Kale that Rena translated in real time. The Kale captain asked who they were. "United Earth Federation," Yuna said. "We were in the area." They were not in the area. They were technically in violation of 4 separate ward species protocols, 2 compact navigation statutes, and at least 1 agreement that Ara was going to have to spend the next week trying to explain away. Yuna was aware of all of this. She had done the calculation before she jumped and decided the Kale's lives outweighed the paperwork. The Valori protection fleet arrived 22 minutes after the engagement ended. Their ships came in slow and formal, all visible power and careful positioning. The lead Valori commander opened a channel to the Hangang and began listing violations in a voice that was very controlled and very cold. Yuna listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You are going to let them die over paperwork." There was a long silence on the channel. She did not fill it. Back at the compact, Ara was summoned to a tribunal within 48 hours. She went in prepared, dressed carefully, carrying Rena's full mission report and a secondary document she had spent 2 days writing herself. She sat down across from the council and waited. What she did not expect was the Kale captain standing up before she could speak. The Kale did not speak in formal compact sessions. They never had. They were too small, too quiet, too careful to make noise in rooms full of powerful species. But the Kyle captain stood up and in a voice that only trembled slightly told the council what he had seen, what had happened to his convoy, who had come and how fast, and what they had chosen not to destroy. He sat back down. The room was very still. The charges against humanity were dropped by the end of the session. On the way out, Ara stepped into a corridor and sent a short message to the Hangang. It said, "Cleared. Also, the Kyle just made galactic history. You're welcome, and also please warn me next time." Yuna read it, sent back a single word, "Noted," and went to find Tyke, who owed her a report on the weapon systems and had almost certainly forgotten about it because he was eating again. Something had changed. She could feel it, the way you feel a pressure shift before a storm. The smaller species had seen what happened. The Drex had 1 ship that went home with a story to tell, and the Valori, for the first time in what was probably centuries, had been second to arrive. They were watching her now. All of them. Good, she thought. Let them watch. Rena did not sleep much. That was not new. She had never been a good sleeper, even back on Earth, even before any of this. Her mind moved too fast at night, pulling at loose threads, turning small details over and over until they either made sense or became something bigger than she expected. Most of the time, they just made sense. But sometimes they became something bigger. This was one of those times. She had started with the raid data from neutral space, the 4 Drex ships, their approach vectors, the timing of the intercept. It was a clean raid, technically speaking. Fast entry, controlled positioning. No unnecessary destruction. Professional. She noted that and moved on. Then she pulled the records from the 2 raids before that one. Different sector, different convoy, same pattern, fast, clean, controlled. She pulled 6 more raids going back 14 months. Same thing, every time. The Drex had a reputation for being brutal. That reputation was not wrong, but brutality and precision were not the same thing. And what she was seeing in this data was precision, not the behavior of a species raiding for resources or for sport. Something more deliberate. She sat with that thought for a long time. Then she started mapping the locations. She put every confirmed Drex raid from the past 2 years on the star map and looked at the shape they made together. It took her a while to see it because she was looking for a geographic pattern, a region being targeted, a supply route being hit repeatedly. That was not what the map showed. The raids were spread out, different sectors, different species, different types of cargo. But when she filtered by something else, by proximity to Valori patrol routes, by distance from Valori border stations, the shape changed entirely. Every single raid had been conducted within sensor range of a Valori position, not close enough to trigger engagement, just close enough to be seen. She stared at the map for a long time. Then she opened a secondary file and pulled the response time data, how long it took Valori patrols to reach each raid site after the incident was reported. She cross-referenced it with the duration of each raid. The Drex had never stayed longer than the response window. Never, not once in 2 years. They knew to the minute how long they had before Valori ships would arrive. They were not raiding. They were measuring. Rena saved everything, compiled it into a single document, and walked down the corridor to Yuna's cabin at 2 in the morning. She knocked twice. The door opened in 4 seconds, which meant Yuna had not been asleep either. Rena set the document on the desk without saying anything. Yuna read it standing up, still in her crew clothes, cup of tea going cold beside her elbow. She read the whole thing without speaking. When she finished, she looked up at Rena. "You're sure about the response time correlation?" "I ran it 4 times, Rena said. "Different methods. Same result every time." Yuna looked back at the map. "They're not testing the convoys," she said quietly. "They're testing the fleet." "Yes. Which means they're planning something that requires knowing exactly how the Valori respond." "Yes." Yuna closed the document. "Get Wu Jin. Tell him I need him to look at something in the morning." She paused. "And Rena, good work." Rena nodded and left. She slept 4 hours after that, which for her was quite good. Wu Jin came in the next morning with his own edition. He had been running separate diagnostics, not on the Drex data, but on Valori infrastructure records that were technically public, but written in a format so dense and bureaucratic that nobody outside the Compact's own offices ever actually read them. He had written a small program to do it for him. The program had found something that 3 separate Valori administrative offices had each individually logged as equipment failure. 3 border stations. Dark. In the past 6 months. 1 station going dark was equipment failure. 2 was a pattern. 3 was something else entirely. Wu Jin put his data next to Rena's data, and the picture they made together was not comfortable to look at. Yuna took both reports and requested a formal meeting with the Valori High Consul. Not through Aura, not through diplomatic channels. Directly as the commanding officer of the UEF Vanguard Fleet. It was slightly outside protocol. The consul agreed to the meeting anyway, which told Yuna something by itself. They met aboard the consul's ship. It was a large vessel, old, decorated in the way that things are decorated when they are meant to remind you of how long the person inside has been important. The consul stood at the center of a wide room with high curved walls and received Yuna the way he received most humans, with patient courtesy and the faint air of someone who has already decided how the conversation will end. Then Yuna put the documents on the table. She walked him through Rena's data first. The raid pattern, the response time correlation, the shape of it. Not resource raids, not territorial aggression, but systematic observation. The Drex learning the Valori fleet's habits the way you learn a lock before you pick it. The consul was quiet but still composed. He had good control of his face. Then Wu Jin's file, the 3 border stations, the dates, the logged explanations. The statistical probability that all three failures were unrelated and coincidental, which Wu Jin had calculated at just under 1%. The console sat down. It was a small movement, the kind that happens when something heavy lands on a person all at once and their body responds before their composure can catch up. He sat down in his chair and looked at the documents, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all. Yuna waited. She was good at waiting. When he spoke, it came out slowly. There had been internal reports, he said, concerns raised within the Compact's own intelligence division over the past decade. Drek's military production had increased. Fleet movements near the outer corridors had become more frequent. There had been proposals, discussions, about opening formal dialogue with the Drek's high command before the situation developed further. Nothing had been done. Yuna watched him talk and understood, piece by piece, what she was actually hearing. It was not incompetence. It was something more human than that, more universal than that. It was the very old, very common mistake of people who had been powerful for so long that they had quietly forgotten what it felt like to be threatened. The Valori had not fought a real war in 300 years. Their fleet was enormous and ancient and had not been tested in living memory. And somewhere in those 300 years, the gap between looking powerful and being ready had grown very wide without anyone choosing to measure it. They had not told humanity about the Dreks because they were afraid. Not of the Dreks specifically, or not only that, they were afraid of being seen. Of having a ward species look at them and understand that the protection being offered was coming from people who were no longer sure they could deliver it. Yuna let him finish. Then she said, quietly and without cruelty, "You didn't protect us from the Dreks. You were hoping we'd never have to meet them." The consul did not deny it. Daeho's message came in 20 minutes later, flagged urgent. Yuna read it at the table in front of the consul. Drek's fleet movement, not a raid group, not a patrol. A staging formation, massive and organized, currently positioned 2 weeks from Valori home space. She set the comm down and looked at the consul. He had aged in the past hour in a way that had nothing to do with time. "What do we do?" he asked. It was a quiet question, almost small, coming from the head of the oldest governing body in the known galaxy, addressed to the commander of a species that was not even supposed to leave its own solar system without an escort. Yuna looked at him for a moment, then she reached across the table and pulled both documents back toward her, straightening the edges neatly. "First," she said, "you stop filing things as equipment failure." She stood up. "Then we get to work." Nobody officially gave Yuna command of the Joint Defense. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward, at least not in formal records. There was no ceremony, no transfer of authority signed and stamped and logged into the Compact system. What happened was simpler and stranger than that. The Valori admirals arrived at the planning session aboard the Hangang, 6 of them, old and decorated, with more combined years of service than most human civilizations had existed, and within the first hour, they were all looking at Yuna when they had a question, not at each other, not at the consul's representative seated at the head of the table, at Yuna. And at some point between the first hour and the second, she had stopped waiting to be asked and had simply started directing, and nobody stopped her, and that was how it happened. Daeho noticed. He said nothing. He just quietly updated the operational command structure in the Hangang system and made sure the Valori ships received the revised file. There were 2 weeks before the Dreks formation would reach striking distance. It was not enough time. Yuna decided to treat it as enough time anyway, because the alternative was not useful. She split the work into 3 streams and ran them all at once. Wu Jin took the Valori ships. He went aboard the nearest Valori cruiser with a small team and a portable kit and asked to see the shielding systems. The Valori engineers showed him with visible pride. Layered energy barriers, elegant and complex. Centuries of refinement built into every component. Wu Jin looked at them for a long time. Then he asked very politely when they had last been stress-tested against modern Drek's weapons output. The engineers looked at each other. Wu Jin spent the next 11 days rebuilding the shielding on 7 Valori ships, using a combination of human metallurgical plating and a power cycling technique that the Valori engineering manual specifically described as inadvisable. The Valori engineers watched him work with expressions that moved slowly from skepticism to discomfort to reluctant fascination. The modified ships ran hot and loud and looked wrong compared to the clean lines of standard Valori design. They also as Wu Jin demonstrated in a controlled test, absorbed 30% more impact before barrier failure than any unmodified ship in the fleet. One of the Valori engineers asked him where he had learned that technique. Wu Jin thought about it. Fixing things that people said couldn't be fixed, he said. We do a lot of that. Taik took the ground soldiers. The Valori had ground forces. They were well-equipped, disciplined, and moved beautifully in formal exercises. What they had not done in 3 centuries was fight in close quarters against an enemy that did not follow predictable patterns. Taik watched them run drills on the first day, and then spent the evening writing a training plan that he described to Daiho as fixing the part where they fight like they're being graded. The Valori soldiers were not happy about the new training. It was loud, fast, physically uncomfortable. And Taik had a way of explaining things that was direct to the point of being blunt, and sometimes slightly past that point. There were complaints on the second day. On the 4th day, one of the Valori squad leaders, a tall soldier named Vael, who had twice as many formal commendations as anyone else in the unit, challenged Taik's method openly during a session. Taik listened to the challenge with his arms folded. Then he asked Vael to come at him. Full contact right now. He earns and show him what the formal method looked like in practice. What followed lasted about 8 seconds. Vael was not hurt. His dignity recovered over the next day or so, and after that the complaints stopped and the soldiers started actually listening, and by the end of the second week, they were moving differently. Faster, less formal, with the slightly controlled chaos that Taik had been trying to teach them all along. Rena worked the intelligence side. She had been building a behavioral profile of Drex commanders for months from raid data, and she knew one thing about them with confidence. They were rational. Everything they did was calculated, efficient. They entered engagements with clear objectives and executed against those objectives without deviation. It was a strength. Against most opponents, it was an overwhelming strength. Against humans, it was a problem. She brought her analysis to Yuna 3 days before the expected engagement window. They can model a logical enemy, she said, pointing to the behavioral data on the screen. They have centuries of combat data on Valori tactics. They know the response windows, the formation patterns, the decision trees. They've been studying it for 2 years at minimum. She paused. They have no data on us. Yuna looked at the screen. What do we do with that? We don't fight them the way they expect to be fought, Rena said. We make decisions that their models can't predict. We do things that look wrong on paper, but work anyway. She looked at Yuna steadily. Things that would give a combat AI an existential crisis. Yuna almost smiled. Draw it up, she said. The battle came on a Tuesday, ship time, which Taik said felt about right. The Drex formation was enormous, 41 ships moving in a tight, practiced pattern that had clearly been rehearsed. They came in confident, because why wouldn't they? They had the numbers. They had the data. They had spent 2 years learning the shape of this fight before it started. What they had not planned for was the feint. A small force, human-led 8 Valori ships with Wu Jin's modifications, the Hangang at the center, moved out to meet the Drex vanguard head-on. It looked like exactly the kind of move a rational commander would never make. EU badly outnumbered, advancing instead of holding the defensive line. The Drex models would have flagged it immediately as either a mistake or a trap, and because they were rational, they would have prepared for both. What they were not prepared for was the third option, which was that Yuna simply intended to hold that line through sheer refusal to break for as long as it took. They took damage, real damage. The Hanggang's port shielding went down twice, and Wu Jin fixed it from inside the wall panels while the ship was still being hit, which Daiho watched happening and then looked away from because it was less alarming that way. But they held. They drew the Drex main fleet forward, out of their formation, pushing to finish what looked like an easy target. Then Wu Jin did the impossible thing. He had been working on the jump corridor math for 6 days. The theory was simple enough. If you collapsed the entry point of a jump corridor behind a fleet in motion, they couldn't retreat through it. The practice was something the Valori admirals had told him the laws of physics did not allow. Wu Jin had listened carefully to this and then asked if they had ever actually tried it. They had not. The corridor collapsed cleanly behind the Drex main force, 41 ships. suddenly with nowhere to go but forward into a fight that had just changed shape entirely. The Drex vanguard pulled back in confusion, the formation broke, and in the few minutes of disorganized repositioning that followed, the full Velori fleet, Tack's retrained ground support prepped and ready. Rena's unpredictable maneuver patterns fed to every ship commander, hit them from 4 directions at once. It was not a massacre. Una made sure of that. With the Drex formation broken and the main fleet trapped, she opened a channel to the Drex High Commander. She had written what she wanted to say the night before, revised it twice, cut it down to the shortest version that still contained everything that needed to be in it. She offered terms, a ceasefire, a defined boundary, a framework for formal contact going forward. She made clear what had happened here, what the numbers looked like, and what the alternative to accepting the terms would mean for the ships currently trapped behind a closed jump corridor. She did not threaten, she did not perform, she just laid it out. The way you lay out facts. The Drex High Commander was silent for 90 seconds. It was a long 90 seconds. Then he asked in careful translated language which species she belonged to. Human, she said. We're a ward species. Another silence, shorter this time. We accept the terms, he said. The ceasefire was recorded at 1847 hours ship time. Ara handled the formalization with the precision and grace that she always brought to things, and when she came out of the final session, she looked tired in a very satisfied way. The Drex High Commander, before his fleet pulled back, made one more transmission. It was addressed to the Compact's official registry. It was short. It removed the ward species designation from humanity's entry in the Drex records and replaced it with a single word in the Drex language. Rena translated it that evening, sitting at her desk with a cup of tea. She sat with the translation for a while before she sent it to Una. It meant, as close as she could render it in plain language, ones you do not corner. She thought that was about right. The Galactic Compact called its largest session in 200 years. That was not a small thing. Full sessions of the Compact were rare and slow, and required the kind of coordination that took months under normal circumstances. This one was called in 11 days, which by Compact standards was approximately the speed of panic dressed up in formal robes. Species that had not sent a representative to a full session in decades sent 2. The chamber was full in a way it had not been in living memory for most of the people inside it. Una was not there for the opening. She was in a repair bay, 3 decks below the Hangang's bridge, lying on her back, under a section of exposed hull plating, with a torch in one hand and a fastening tool in the other. The port shielding had taken serious damage in the battle, and the automated repair systems had patched the critical failures well enough, but there were secondary joints along the lower hull that the system had flagged as low priority and left for later. Una did not like leaving things for later. Daiho found her there an hour after the session opened. He stood at the entrance to the bay and looked at her boots sticking out from under the plating. "The Compact is in session," he said. "I know," she said from under the hull. "Ara is representing us." "I know." "You could watch the feed." There was the sound of something being tightened. "Hand me the number 4 driver." Daiho picked it up from the tool rack and crouched down to pass it to her. Her hand came out, took it, disappeared again. He sat down on the equipment case nearby and waited, because that was what he did. Tyke came by 20 minutes later with food for both of them, because that was what he did. Inside the Compact chamber, Era was doing what she did best. She sat at the human delegation table in a gray jacket with no decoration on it, which was a deliberate choice in a room full of species who communicated status through the complexity of what they wore. She had her documents in order, her notes memorized, and the particular quality of stillness that she could produce when needed. The kind that made the people across the table feel, without quite knowing why, that she had already thought further ahead than they had. The Velori High Consul spoke first. That was expected. What was not expected was what he said. He did not open with a defense of the Compact's handling of the Drex situation. He did not reframe the timeline or soften the facts about what had been known and left unacted upon. He stood up in front of the fullest chamber in 2 centuries and said, in plain language, that the Compact had made a serious mistake. That the ward species classification, built on the idea that older civilizations were better equipped to judge which younger ones deserved freedom, had failed in the most direct way possible. The species they had classified as needing protection had been the ones to provide it. He proposed abolishing the ward species classification entirely. The chamber was quiet for a moment after he finished. Not the quiet of disagreement, the quiet of a room full of people recalibrating. Several species spoke after him. Most were in favor. Two older compact members raised procedural concerns about the pace of the change, which Ara noted and then addressed with the kind of calm, specific, thoroughly prepared counterargument that made the procedural concerns quietly disappear. The Kale representative spoke near the end of the session. She was young, small even by Kale standards, and her voice was not loud. But the chamber listened. She talked about the convoy in neutral space. She talked about 11 minutes. She talked about what it meant to have someone jump to your side, not because a form had been filed or a mandate had been checked, but simply because it was the right thing to do. She sat down to a silence that was more respectful than any applause. The vote to abolish the ward species classification passed before the third hour of the session ended. Then the consul raised the second matter. Full compact membership for humanity had been discussed before. Quietly, in back channels, since the battle. The formal offer now was made openly in a full chamber, which meant it was real and it was recorded and it could not be quietly walked back later. Compact membership and a seat on the High Council, the inner circle that set policy for the entire Galactic Compact and had not added a new member in 40 years. Hera paused. She did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind. It told the chamber that humanity was not desperate. You was not overwhelmed by the offer, was going to treat this the way it treated everything, which was carefully and on its own terms. She excused herself briefly and stepped into the corridor outside the chamber. She called Yuna. The comm connected after 2 pulses. There was background noise, the sounds of a repair bay, metal on metal, someone nearby talking in a low voice. "They're offering us a council seat," Ara said. A pause. "Do we want one?" R leaned against the corridor wall and thought about that for a second. She thought about the past months, the patrol gaps Rena had mapped, the ceasefire terms Yuna had written by hand the night before a battle, the Kel captain standing up in a tribunal, the Drex High Commander's single word filed into the Galactic Registry. "I think we've already been running one," she said. A longer pause this time, the sound of something being set down. "Tell them yes," Yuna said. "But we pick our own chair." Ara smiled, which was not something she did often in professional settings. She straightened her jacket, walked back into the chamber, and delivered humanity's acceptance in 3 clean sentences that left no room for conditions or amendments. The session ended an hour later. Several minor species, the Kale among them, filed their own petitions for full compact membership before the chamber closed. The compact's administrative office, which had not processed a new membership application in decades, received 4 petitions in one afternoon. The clerk responsible for intake reportedly sat at his desk for a while without moving before he started on the paperwork. The Valori liaison came to the Hanggang that evening. He was the same one who had stood on the bridge in the early days and explained to Yuna why humanity needed protection. He looked older than he had then, though not much time had actually passed. It was the kind of older that comes from a change in understanding rather than a change in years. He was shown to the forward observation deck by a crew member who didn't know who he was, just that someone senior had cleared the visit. Yuna was already there. She was standing at the wide forward window, looking out at the stars. The Valori ships were still visible at the edge of the display, smaller now that they had repositioned. The Hanggang's new patrol route extended out past them, 3 times the range of the old one, plotted and filed by Yuna's own navigation team without anyone asking for permission, because no one needed to ask for permission anymore. The liaison stood beside her at the window. He looked out at the same stars she was looking at. He asked after a while whether she had ever felt that humanity needed protecting. Yuna did not answer right away. She watched the light of distant systems move slowly across the glass. She thought about Wu Jin on a stool eating noodles when the Vialori boarded, Tyke teaching alien soldiers to stop fighting like they were being graded, Rena awake at 2 in the morning pulling a thread no one else had thought to pull, Daeho handing her a tool under a broken hull without asking why. She thought about the Coil captain's voice in the tribunal, trembling slightly, but still speaking. She thought about a Drex High commander going quiet for 90 seconds before accepting terms from a Ward species commander. "Everyone needs protecting sometimes," she said. Her voice was quiet and even. "The trick is knowing when it's your turn to stand in front." She turned away from the window and walked back toward the bridge. Her steps were steady and unhurried, the walk of someone who knew exactly where they were going. The liaison stood alone at the window for a long time after she left. He looked out at the stars. The same stars, but somehow different now, arranged in a shape he was still learning to read. The Hanggang moved through the dark ahead of him, smooth and certain, cutting its own line through space the way it had always done. Like it was born there, he watched it until it was too small to see. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come, and the corridor was quiet around him. And the galaxy outside was very large, and somewhere out in it, a Ward species was flying point for everyone. End.